Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Physiology Secrets podcast. A bit of a Ask Met style podcast this time after we've had a few guests on. And sorry for being up a little bit late this week, been a little bit busy sort of running around. But got Luke here to sort of chat through a few questions that have come through over the last little bit regarding altitude and understanding the effects of altitude, a little bit on VO2 and threshold and how they interrelate across different athletes. So we'll start with the altitude question that came through from one of our high performance guys, Glenn. He was sort of interested in understanding the effects of altitude training as a marathon runner, how that can help him in terms of performance. So what the benefit of doing some altitude work is it a case of training there, sleeping in altitude? Do you want to just quickly run down the protocol that we sent out to him and what we recommend in terms of getting the most out of adding that into his regime?
Yeah, cool. So just a bit of background. So what Glenn did was he bought an altitude tent. So that's basically just a fancy tent that you put over your bedroom, full bedroom for him, was it?
No, so he got one for his bed initially. He's thinking of doing the room though because it's a little bit more practical for him to be around the house. So
so he put it over his bed. So basically what that does is it artificially takes oxygen out of the air. So at the moment we've got about 21% of oxygen in the air. He's reducing that down to probably about 13%. So there's less oxygen, your body adapts, it starts to use oxygen better. There's a really simplistic way to do it. So the theory behind it is there's a thing called live high, train low. So ideally you want to live in a high altitude environment such as an altitude tent, which reduces the oxygen, but then you actually want to train in a normal environment so you can keep the intensity high, because once you start to reduce the oxygen in the air, it's obviously a lot harder to maintain a high intensity because less aerobic system, more anaerobic system, more byproducts, more fatigue. Okay, so let's get into the protocol. So basically the ideal protocol is 12 hours a day of continuous exposure, which is quite a lot, at, correct me if I'm wrong, 21 to 2,500 metres?
Yeah, 21 to 2,400.
2,400 metres above sea level, which is reduced oxygen for 3 weeks of exposure. So it's 12 hours a day for 3 weeks at a relatively high altitude. The question he had for both of us is 12 hours is pretty unrealistic, really. For
day-to-day for a non-professional.
Yeah, you don't want to sort of sit in your bed for 12 hours a day. His question was, could we do, say, 10 hours a day at either more altitude or just more than 3 weeks? I mean, short answer is I don't really know, but you would assume that 10 hours at a similar altitude or a little bit more is going to be better than doing nothing. So you will still get the benefit from having 10 hours. It's just like when you go for a training session, hey, I can't spend 16 minutes at time at 95% VO2max, but I spend 12 minutes at it. Yes, it's still better than doing nothing. So you still will get benefit. How much benefit? Generally speaking, about 3% performance improvement, which is significant. 3% is significant if you're already at your peak. If you are just starting out, 3%, you can just go out and do some more training to get 3%. But when you are starting to hit that performance plateau, 3% improvement is quite significant. So that's what the process is going to go through. And it's one of those ones where that 3 weeks, or we said to Glenn 4 weeks because he's only doing 10 hours, you'll get that 3% benefit. And then if you jump out of the altitude tent, that'll last for about a similar amount of time, probably about 3 weeks. But you're not going to keep getting more benefit out of that as well, because your blood components, that they're going to hit their safe maximum and they're going to plateau out. So that's a little bit about what he's up to.
Yeah. So we briefly touched on live high, train low. Do you want to just give me quickly your thoughts on? There's a few gyms that have popped up that are sort of promoting the opposite. Is there much benefit in Glenn doing a bit of training at that altitude and then having the normal air exposure, or doing it the other way in terms of having like a 1 hour session at altitude and then just living back at sea level, or does it only work when you're living high and training low? Yeah.
So I guess, as I said before, something is better than nothing. So yes, it's going to work to an extent, but you've got to look. It's a balancing act. If you go do a session in a simulated altitude environment where you've got less oxygen, that's good, but your intensity is going to reduce, and therefore if your intensity reduces, your stimulus might reduce, and it might sort of counterbalance each other out. So if you wanted to do a zone 2 session, potentially you could look at doing that. I think it's more applicable if you we've had a few mountaineers come in who are actually training at altitude, or not training at altitude, they're going to have to perform at altitude, so then at least now that is a sport specific environment for them. So it's definitely useful for that. But if you are training at a normal altitude, if you're competing at a normal altitude, you are better off to try to sleep at altitude
Yeah.
and keep your training in a normal environment so you can maintain that intensity.
Yeah, maintain that training quality and just get the physiological adaptation to being in that environment rather than actually physically having to train in it.
Yeah, spot on.
Which is the spot on one there. So a little bit on altitude there, covers off basically the core principles to it. It's really sort of the key is that continuous exposure and consistent exposure. It's not something you can go in and just solve in a day. It takes a couple of weeks to adapt, but then also it disappears quite quickly. So timing of that altitude, we spoke to him about when it's probably best for him to implement the really long doses of the altitude exposure. You want to just quickly tap into when ideally we should go into sleeping in altitude more so, and then to time it perfectly for your key event.
Yeah, of course. So as I said, it takes 3 to maybe 4 weeks if it's less than 12 hours to do it. So I'd recommend doing it probably 6 weeks out from a key event. So we said it lasts about a 1-to-1, 3 weeks of continuous exposure. You'll see those benefits for 3 weeks or so, and then it might start to reduce off a bit. So probably about 6 weeks out is fine.
Yeah.
I remember a question he asked us was, should I just do it all year round? You can, but you don't need to.
Yeah.
That's no, like you can. If you get quite comfortable with sleeping at altitude, that's great.
He did ask a question on recovery though.
He did,
which is probably the interesting thing, if that cuts you off a little bit too soon. But how do you perceive it as impacting his recovery day to day? If he's sleeping in it, doing a hard session during the day at sea level, then sleeping at altitude where there's less oxygen, does it make it longer for him to recover, or?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and again, it's one that I would say that I've got a fair idea, but at the same time, further research is probably required. Will it affect recovery? It's not going to make recovery better, that's for sure. Yeah. So if anything, it's going to be the same or maybe slightly worse recovery. If we have less oxygen in the air, look, we know the body needs oxygen to metabolise lactic acid, the fatiguing component of the anaerobic system there. To repair muscle tissue, we need oxygen. Lots of things we need oxygen for. So by reducing that oxygen, you would think that that's probably not going to be ideal. At least it's at a low intensity. So you're still going to have, as in resting intensity, so you're still going to have plenty coming in. So it may not affect too much. But then again, you look at hyperbaric chambers, which is very high in oxygen, so where it gets it to 100% oxygen, right? So you, as opposed to the 21% that we have, and then you pump up the pressure to let it diffuse into your muscles more. That is very good at recovering yourself a lot quicker. So you would assume that, all right, if that's good for recovery, then by reducing our oxygen concentration, it's probably not ideal. But again, it is a resting intensity, so it's either going to be the same or maybe slightly hinder that recovery. Probably the main thing that will hinder your recovery is I've heard that anecdotally people struggle to sleep at that altitude just because it's a different environment. It's kind of not even necessarily because of the oxygen concentration, just because you've got a tent over you, you're not used to that. So if your sleep is affected, that's obviously going to be quite detrimental to your recovery. So it is an interesting one. And if somebody does struggle to sleep and recover through that, then as I said, just do it for 3 to 4 weeks, and then basically periodise it. Do it, recover, so on and so forth. James Hansen, we know, he did it for 9 months straight, so he's a 3:38 runner for 1500. Obviously, he's quite comfortable in that, so no problems to do it all year round if you want to, but you will plateau at that about 3%, and you've got to weigh up whether it's affecting your recovery or not.
Yeah, cool. So, a bit to think about around altitude. We'll also work with Glenn over the next little while. We're sort of interested to monitor his progress with it and see how he's actually tracking with it too. Next question that did come in, I think it was Luke who sent the question in. He was asking about athletes who might be at a similar fitness level, performance level, that might have the same VO2 max. How can they potentially have a slightly different threshold or percentage of that VO2 max that they can use? Yeah,
it's a good question. So his question was, if you have two athletes of the same VO2 max, we always say, hey, it depends on your threshold. Why does threshold change? Physiologically, what is the reason for that change individually? And it is a good question, and it's one of those ones where, look, we can go into a lot of biochemistry, which I don't even understand, so I'm not going to bother. It's pretty complicated. As a really simplistic way of putting it, VO2 max is an aerobic adaptation. And your buffering capacity and tolerance of that lactic acid is more of an anaerobic adaptation, okay? And that's where the difference happens. So you might be aerobically very similar or the same, but then anaerobically you've got variations, okay? So the body, as a brief background, your body dumps bicarbonate, okay? So your blood is a certain pH level, 7.35 to 7.45, all right? We have bicarb, it brings it higher, which is not necessarily good or bad, but it's less acidic. We produce hydrogen ions, lactic acid, the burn of the legs, it brings it down. So what your body does is, this is where it wants to be in terms of pH. We start to exercise high intensity, we get those hydrogen ions, the lactic acid in the blood, it reduces the pH. The body then dumps bicarbonate, which is the opposite, and brings it back up again. Okay, so the body can get better at dumping bicarbonate through traditionally anaerobic training. So really a lot of sprint stuff with low recovery, etc. So that's sort of physiologically the reason why some people can only hold 70%, others can hold 95%. It's going to come down to your training history, your genetics, slow twitch versus fast twitch fibers, and they're sort of the two main factors there as well. So we've seen people that obviously can hold 7+ millimoles of lactate before they hit their threshold, and then somebody who is maybe genetically predisposed to slow twitch fibers, and maybe they only do long, slow, continuous training, 2.93 millimoles of lactate, and then they get that exponential rise. So it's to do with the genetic composition of slow twitch, fast twitch, and also your training history in terms of whether you're doing aerobic or anaerobic training. Yeah,
you touched on it briefly there. In terms of if you were to look at two athletes who had similar VO2 max, if for example used professional level where there's probably not too much more they can go, they've hit their ceiling as to where their VO2 max can get. If we've got one athlete who's sitting at their threshold sitting at 90% of their VO2 max or 95%, really, really high, and an athlete is slightly lower, what would you prescribe in terms of types of training session to try and boost it up specifically? What are you targeting?
Yeah, so obviously it's anaerobic, dominantly anaerobic training, because we want to get the body better at dumping that bicarbonate. So we're looking at that zone 3 and zone 5 stuff, which we've spoken about a lot. So a zone 3 session might be spending time basically at or slightly above that threshold. So you're producing quite a lot of that lactic acid, and then you're having a smaller recovery. So it might be 5 minutes at or above, maybe you're at 105% of your threshold. Your legs are burning, but then you only have a 2.5 minute, say, float recovery where you jog around. So your lactic acid is coming in, you have a partial recovery, it's still in there, back in again. So your body, because you're constantly in the presence of elevated lactic acid levels, your body's going to get better at tolerating and dumping that bicarb to bring it back down. Another good one is maybe more sort of, what would you call it, repeat sprint training, I suppose, where you go flat out for, not even a sprint, 30 seconds, you might be going flat out, having a slightly longer recovery. But all you need to do is get that lactic acid in the body, have a partial recovery, and then go again. Okay, it's a little bit different to the VO2 style stuff where we want to have a full recovery so we can hit that high intensity. We might not need to go that high, but we need to be essentially in pain the whole time, more or less.
Making yourself hurt,
exactly
so you
right.
Tolerate it. Yeah, cool. Second part to Luke's question that I've got in my notes here was, why then is something like your threshold or lactate inflection point the same thing, if you like? Why is that the better indicator of performance over VO2 max? So if we have two athletes with different VO2 maxes, one's got a high VO2 max, but the other one can hold a greater percentage of their engine. Why is threshold more of that performance indicator rather than VO2 max?
Yeah, cool. I'll probably go one further than that. Context is important, but the best indicator of who is going to win a race is velocity at lactate threshold. Okay, because velocity at lactate threshold not only takes into account what is your lactate threshold, it's also how economically are you moving. Let's say running, for example, how economically are you using the oxygen that you're creating. So your VO2 max is not functional. You can't really use. You could be at 100% VO2 max for. It's going to vary depending on stuff, but 3 to maybe 5 minutes if you're lucky. Okay, so it's not really that specific if we're talking about a 10k, half marathon, full marathon, whatever it is. Right? If you're a 1500 meter runner, VO2 max generally is a better indicator. Okay, but anything over about 5 minutes, we're looking at the velocity at lactate threshold, and the reason that is because lactate threshold, in theory, our lactic acid coming in is exactly met by what's coming out. So we're at a nice steady state. We can hold this for 45 to 60 minutes plus or minus, depending on your training history. Whereas, as I said, VO2 max you can only hold for sort of 3 to 5 minutes. So that's why it's a better indicator. If you have a race that's more than 5 minutes, it's not about how fast you can run over 10 seconds or a minute or 3 minutes, it's how much you can maintain that. So once you go beyond your lactate inflection point, beyond your threshold, your lactic acid starts to accumulate in the blood. It's just a matter of time until that keeps building up, causes that very severe burn, and you have to slow down to clear it out. So that's sort of why. Velocity at lactate threshold, as I said, takes into account not just that threshold, but also how well or how economical you're moving You want to be able to run as fast as possible using the least amount of oxygen as possible as well to best maximise your performance.
Yeah, and does that still hold true for the longer duration events? So you said 45 to an hour is that theoretical time that we can sit on that threshold for. If you're going out and doing a 4 hour, 5 hour, 6 hour event, is it relative then, like your performance is relative to that? So if you've got that high velocity at threshold, then you're likely going to be able to hold a slightly higher, lower intensity, if you like, slightly higher sub-maximal.
Yep.
Does that make sense where I'm going?
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Threshold's way up here, so now I should be able to race a 5 hour race at this intensity and a 10 hour there, as opposed to my threshold's further back, obviously.
Yeah, even though threshold's meant to be for an hour, is it still beneficial for a 6 hour event to work on that and get that as high as possible? It is, yeah, for sure it is. But obviously, as we go longer, 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, there's more components of endurance success. And maybe we'll link that article with the seven core components. Because once we get longer, then it's not just about, especially after 2 hours, it's not just about what is your velocity lactate threshold. It's who can eat the most carbohydrates. You know, it's your fat versus carb. Rehydration. What's the temperature like? There's a lot more factors that play a part when we get into longer duration events. I'd still recommend getting that threshold up as high as possible, but I suppose once we're going sort of 5 hours beyond, then it's, let's be specific as well, okay? You're not going to hold threshold for that long, it's not going to happen. But if you can get a higher threshold and have less lactic acid being produced, you're going to have less running and perceived exertion, you probably need a little bit more fat compared to carbohydrates, so you push it up more because your body's better at using oxygen, so that's good. And then so long as you are then supplementing and getting carbohydrates back in, you should be able to hold a higher intensity for longer. But there are
stuff you have to consider, all those other factors that go into it. So anything else you want to add on either of those?
Look, maybe just talking about aerobic capacity for the longer stuff. Aerobic capacity is basically being able to use oxygen for the duration of an event. You want to have a very solid aerobic capacity to be able to run for, or whatever, 5, 6, 7 hours. You need to be able to be quite economical and efficient at using that oxygen. So you might find if you go out for a run, I always found it back when I'm still not very fit, but when I'm not an aerobic athlete, but I always found that after about 2 hours of running, my heart rate would then start to drift up. Same pace, but it would start to drift up, and I was hydrating plenty. That was all fine, but my body, I didn't have the aerobic capacity to continue using oxygen economically and efficiently there. So aerobic capacity is basically doing your zone 2 long slow stuff. That's probably going to be the better, or not better, it's one of the indicators for that 5, 6, 7 hour stuff. You want to have good lactate threshold, but you also want to be able to use oxygen as well as possible. That way you don't need to worry about accumulating lactic acid as well, because they do play a part. So even though one's aerobic, one's anaerobic, if you're better aerobically, you don't need to rely on that anaerobic system until later. That pushes our threshold up, and then once we start to accumulate the lactic acid, then we want to be able to be really good at buffering that through anaerobic style training. So they do work together, but they are different depending on what you do.
And specificity too. If you're doing those long events, it makes sense to do the long slow training. That's what you're going to be racing at. Essentially, you're not going to be racing, like you said, at threshold intensity. If you're racing for 5 hours, an intensity that's only going to last 45, 60 minutes, not really good for you in the long run. So I think we'll leave it there for today. Some really great questions that came through. Please keep sending them to the Mastermind page or emailing them through to us. Happy to answer them on the podcast. If you've got really specific questions you want us to answer about preparation, that we like those 2 little case study scenarios we've sort of been talking about. It'd be really good to have on here. So if anyone does have any questions they want to shoot through, more than welcome to. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.